if you want to say hello to folks, please do.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Heather Malik. I'm a columnist. Wonderful to meet you.
Of course, so nice to meet you.
Catherine Bradley, candidate in Star
Nice to meet you.
Hi.
Saw you. We'll shake anyway. We'll shake anyway. Very nice to see you.
I'm on the editorial board. Nice to meet you.
Fabulous. Very nice to meet you, Diane.
Hi, I'm Carrie Glasser.
Very nice to meet you. Scooch through here. On the web desk? Wonderful. Very nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Catherine Wallace. I'm the assistant medical director.
Very nice to meet you, Catherine.
It's in California.
Wonderful. Great to meet you.
I wanted to see your trial over at
Thank you very much. I'll tap you on the shoulder. How's that? Maybe I'll scooch back around. Oh,
whatever you think.
I've got to get through here. I've got to say hi to you first. How are you? Great to see you.
You know what we should consider? Pictures of
Fabulous.
water
Nice to meet you, Matt.
No more plastic.
This is the hot seat?
Yeah.
Some people get hyper, but
Matt,
next time we'll have a picture and a glass for you.
Yes, thank you. That's okay. I'm not too precious. It's just a lot of
Well, I
plastic.
think we'll get going. Thanks so much for coming to the Star. We're here with Jennifer Keesmaat, candidate for Mayor of Toronto, and my name is Andrew Phillips. I'm editor of the editorial board of the Star, and with us in the room are members of the editorial board, journalists from City Hall Bureau and elsewhere, and senior editors of the Star. And this is all part of our effort to inform our readers about the campaign, and we're very happy to have you with us. We're going to be hearing from you. We're going to be hearing from people in the room. We're also going to be hearing some input from readers who have sent in questions and who may send in questions during the time. So with that, I guess I would invite you just to set the table for us, maybe very, very briefly, maybe a minute or two, and then we'll just go right into questions.
Okay, great. A minute or two. That's very, very briefly. My name is Jennifer Keesmaat. I'm running for mayor here in the city of Toronto. I was born in Hamilton. I was educated at the University of Western Ontario, where I put myself through university. Following that, I built a large company in this city, started out with 3 people, 3 partners, and built it into a large national planning practice, which today employs over 600 people with 4 offices across Canada. I was recruited from that role to become the chief planner in the city of Toronto. I was called not once, not twice, but 3 times by the recruiting firm, and finally said, hey, I better take a look at this. And that launched me into public service. And it was a wonderful opportunity to work with residents in every corner of this city as the chief planner. I was in that role for 5 years. It was an incredible experience. And one of the things that I've discovered since I left that role is that my passion for this city has not waned. And I saw in that role, up close, that there's so much we're doing as a city, but the city of Toronto can be so much more. It can be so much better. There's a tremendous amount of room for us on transit to be delivering a transit system that meets the growth we have in the city and the aspirations of the city to be inclusive. On housing, we're now the most expensive city in Canada in which to rent. This is not a badge of honor, it's a problem, and it's something that we can fix. We can fix this in our city, it's a choice. We also, of course, have a very troubling situation with respect to public safety, whether it's pedestrians crossing the street in this city or cyclists getting hit by streetcars and by vehicles, or the lack of safety that we see in our neighborhoods as a result of gun violence. These are all things that we can fix. It's a choice, it takes a plan, and a leader who's prepared to execute that plan. And that's why I'm running, because I am hopeful and optimistic about this city, and I know we can be doing so much better to create a great city.
Thanks very much. I think I should ask you first of all about the poll results which came out this morning. There's, I think, about 11 days to go or so before the vote. And I mean, I understand that as a candidate you're still running, and as candidates usually say the real poll is on October 22nd. But what explains the fact that you don't really seem to have got that traction, as they say. Did Doug Ford kind of steal the campaign, in effect? We've really only had about a 4-week sprint. Has that been not long enough to get your message through?
Well, first of all, I'm not a pollster, and I leave the polling up to the pollsters. And I, of course, believe, like so many others do, that what matters is election day, and that's why I'm going to use the next 11 days to get my message out. One of the things that I've seen is that when I meet with communities, when I talk with residents in this city, and I ask them some questions about our city and what our city could be doing better, that there is a tremendous disappointment in all of the issues that I've just mentioned, related to transit, related to housing, related to ensuring that we're creating a safe city. So we have an incredible opportunity to be doing so much more. Did Bill 5 and everything that happened with the Premier have an impact on this election? Well, of course it did. But elections always have a whole series of different events. As you're aware, we've had many less debates than we've typically had in an election. And I have made it very clear that I'm interested and willing and prepared to debate any place and any time, precisely because that's a critical part of how you get a vision for the future city out to the residents of this city. So I think that campaigns always have circumstances that are going to impact how the campaign unfolds. I'm committed to continuing over the next 11 days to build a broad consensus around a future city that's an inclusive city, a green city, and a city where we're providing housing for absolutely everyone.
All right, fair enough. So I want to ask you specifically about taxes. Now, I understand you've brought out your rent-to-own plan. I understand that you're proposing a surtax on properties valued, I think, at $4 million and above, a very small
Correct.
percentage of things, and that's that. But what I'm not clear on is property taxes in general. Now, John Tory has made it a signature part of his position in 2014, and he's consistent on this, that he will keep property taxes at or below the rate of inflation. Will you keep property taxes at or below the rate of inflation?
So I have 3 things to say about this. The first is that this city, for many people, is currently not affordable. And the worst thing that we could do as a city is make the city less affordable for those who have the hardest time paying. So as a principle, that's something that I'm committed to. Now, you mentioned the progressive tax, which I have introduced. That's a really good signal of the principle which I will bring to governing as mayor of this city, which is recognizing that those who can pay a little bit more, who've done exceptionally well in this city, ought to be contributing to ensure that those who are new to our city or young people in the city have the same opportunity that previous generations did. So that's the first piece. The second is how we spend money matters in this city. And I think it's a bit rich to be talking about holding the line on taxes while at the same time throwing money out the window on things like rebuilding a crumbling expressway or drawing up new plans. And that's a $500 million rebuild. That's the difference between simply rebuilding the boulevard. That's significant. Mr. Tory promised in the last election that he would build Smart Track, 22 stations, 53 kilometers of new track, and that it would cost taxpayers nothing. Now what we're getting, of course, is a bill for $1.4 billion for 6 GO stations. Now, historically, GO stations have been built and paid for by the province. That's an incredibly raw deal. So the second is making sure that we're using the money that we are collecting from taxpayers in a way that benefits the city in the future.
Okay, I'm still
There's a
not
third
clear
part.
on the
Sure.
actual question, which is, and what I'm hearing, what I interpret from it is when you first talk about the worst thing we could do is to make the city less affordable.
Yes.
What I'm hearing is that for the average not rich property tax owner or property tax payer, property owner, you would not make things less affordable, i.e. you would not raise property taxes above the rate of inflation. Is that accurate?
So the principle I'm bringing, that's correct. The principle
Okay.
I'm bringing
All right.
to governing here is ensuring that we're not increasing the burden. And I think we have to be careful here that we kind of don't play a bit of a game with the tax, because we know that Mr. Tory said he would not raise the transit the cost of transit, but over the course of the past 4 years, the cost of a Metro Pass went from $133 to $146, and that our previous city manager, Peter Wallace, made it clear that not raising the property tax beyond the rate of inflation was actually done on the backs of those who have the most difficulty paying, those transit users.
Right.
And that, there's sort of a little bit of a game with words here, which is why I'm introducing a very different approach, which is based on the principle of not making the city more expensive for those who can least afford to pay. And I've signaled very clearly through the progressive tax that I've introduced that I'm actually willing to do the tough stuff that needs to be done to ensure we have the monies that we need to deliver the infrastructure that we need in this city. So I think it's important to see that as a principle and an approach to governing, which is what I'm bringing forward.
Right, fair enough. I mean, just as an observation, I mean, it's a pretty, it seems like, you and John Tory are basically on the same wavelength on that, right? I mean, the keeping property taxes at or below the rate of inflation, which obviously many people point out that Toronto has the lowest property taxes by far in the region and so forth. But I guess my point would be, and just finally, before turning it over to colleagues, your approach has been, in many cases, it seems to me, to say, I'll do an awful lot of the things that John Tory would do, but I'll do them better and faster. And so it becomes a bit of the differentiation isn't perhaps quite as sharp as some people might prefer. What would you say about that?
Well, I think we can clarify that on a series of specific files. I fundamentally disagree with you.
Right.
I think that Mr. Tory's approach has actually, over the course of the past 4 years, been to increase the burden on those who can afford to pay least. It's under the guise of keeping costs low, but in reality, the vast majority of the population in this city, to your point, can afford to pay more. And that's why a progressive tax is philosophically and inherently different from what Mr. Tory is doing, which is saying everyone will pay the same. And what I'm saying is, no, hold on a minute. We don't want to make the city, we don't want to push the burden on those who can least afford to pay. That's why the TTC fare is such an important part of my example, because in fact, what Mr. Tory has done is made it easier for those who can most afford to pay and made it harder for those who can least afford to pay. And I'm inverting that and doing exactly the opposite in my approach. So it's the opposite.
Carrie?
Sure. I wanted to ask you about your housing plan, sort of the main plank with the 100,000 rental units. You use words like affordable to ordinary people, working class families. But what's the income you're actually attaching to that? What does that mean to you?
So a couple of things. The first is, and I'll just go back to Andrew's question as well about differentiating, because my plan is completely different from Mr. Tory's, and it's not just the number. He said 40,000, I've said 100,000, but my plan is to use city-owned lands to deliver housing that families can afford, and I'll give you the definition. What we're doing right now as a city is we're selling off city-owned land to build luxury condos. And Mr. Tory's plan is a status quo approach to continue doing that, but making a portion of that housing affordable. My approach is to use all of the city-owned land, no more luxury condos, but for housing that families can afford, defined as 80% average market rent. So if we look at the average market rent, 80% below that, that's the first part of the definition.
Incomes actually have nothing to do with what the market rent is. So what's your
Exactly.
actual income? Are we talking $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year? Like, what is the income you're imagining the people in these homes, these ordinary working people, what is it that you think they make?
So the objective is to provide housing that is no less than 30% of a family's overall household income. In general, in the City of Toronto, we can do that with an 80% average market rent. The objective of significantly increasing supply by adding 100,000 units is also about keeping the rents lower in the city, which is what we know happens when we have a significant amount of additional supply. The risk, of course, is that the average market rent just keeps tracking up, and 80% is not 30% of the average household income. That's the risk that could happen. This plan tries to buffer against that by shifting and building a significant amount of rental in the city. That's the intent and objective. But having those two things together, ensuring that the housing is targeting 30% of the average household income, is the way of addressing that. So if incomes go up, the objective is still to be 30% of average household income. Those numbers are always shifting.
I just have one other question on
Sure.
your housing plan. On the rent to own,
Yes.
your surtax would raise $80 million, assuming that you're able to
Correct.
do it, and that's targeted to help 1,000 homes per year for 10 years.
Correct.
So that's 80 million for 1,000 homes. So that's about 80,000 a home. Why is it that the best way to spend public resources, $80 million of public resources to help 1,000 people, when you could help far more in other methods? Why do you think this is the way to go with that much money?
Well, it is about shifting, and I see this as a starting point. It's about shifting to an approach where we're providing access to home ownership in the city for a next generation, and I do think the program can be scaled up significantly over time. It's actually about people being able to stay in the city and see a future in the city, and part of that is absolutely linked to ownership. So there's inherent value to the city in order to deliver on that. And that's actually a relatively low price tag. That's lower than the amount that was subsidized to get people into home ownership in the Pan Am model. The Pan Am model actually provided a higher per unit subsidy or grant. The way we're achieving that is through a second mortgage that is held by the municipality. This is a model that's been used in some other countries. It's not that dissimilar from the way the land leases are used in Amsterdam in order to suppress the value of housing to provide access to home ownership. This is a model that is sustainable. I think it's a model that fits very well with the aspirations of Torontonians, and it can be scaled up.
I just want to remind everybody that we're here with Jennifer Keesmaat, candidate for Mayor of Toronto at the Toronto Star. The editorial board and other editors questioning Ms. Keesmaat about issues relating to the election. Ed, do you want to have a
Yeah, I
question?
just wanted to, on a related topic, one of the criticisms that I've heard, not just from Mr. Tory, but from some planners and people in the industry here in Toronto of your affordable housing plan is that there's some question about whether there's the capacity in the city to actually build 100,000 units in 10 years. And by capacity, they're talking about the number of cranes that are available, the number of skilled tradespeople that are available, the actual literal production capacity of the construction industry. Are you confident that that capacity is there? And if so, why? Like, what research have you done, or how do you answer those criticisms?
So there's two ways. One is that understanding that one of the biggest things that's holding up more development in the city today is actually access to financing. And that's not an issue when we're using city-owned lands in order to deliver more development. The second is that right now we are prioritizing building luxury condos in the city. And what I'm proposing is a shift. I'm proposing is that we prioritize building affordable homes, that we prioritize building affordable rental, and there absolutely will be a shift in the industry. And many developers who I've spoken to have already been exploring, in part because of the work I was doing at Creative Housing and creating a new model around delivering affordable rental. Many in the industry are poised and ready to take advantage of this shift and to deliver the rental housing that we need in the city. So this is why it's not, Mr. Tory's plan is a status quo plan. Let's, keep doing things the way we've been doing them. My plan is actually about saying, no, hold on a minute. As a city, we're going to shift where our resources go. We're going to shift and build a different type of housing product. And the good news is we actually did this a long time ago. We did this under David Crombie. Big shift under David Crombie. An enormous emphasis went into building affordable housing, and the market shifted. And that's why we have St. Lawrence neighborhood, which has stood the test of time.
So I understand you're talking about this shift in response to a question about the capacity of the construction industry. Is not necessarily that 60,000 more units would be built than would otherwise be built, but that we're moving our approvals, we're moving our capacity from building luxury condos to affordable rental units.
So we'll be building more, but we'll also shift the industry towards building more affordable units. That's a significant change and a very different commitment from what Mr. Tory has made, and it is about ensuring that we're providing a city where we're building housing that's accessible to everyone.
Okay. I just wanted to shift gears then, because one of the things that's most interested me about your campaign, but we haven't had a chance to talk about it in detail, is with the cut to the size of city council, the question is about responsiveness to neighborhood concerns, ground level stuff, the stuff that city councilors traditionally do as constituency work. And you've mentioned stronger community councils and participatory budgeting as potential sort of making lemonade out of lemons here, addressing that. Can you give a bit more detail about what you envision in terms of making the community council stronger?
Sure. So one of the things that's going to happen the minute that this new council is put in place is that there is going to have to be significant work undertaken in reconfiguring how community councils function. The good news is that so currently there's 4, and they mostly deal with local planning matters that then get bumped up to city council. There's 2 really significant opportunities. One is to add citizen representation, and we can do that within the City of Toronto Act already today. So there's pretty significant room that we haven't yet used or exploited really within our existing parameters in order to deliver better local community-based governance. The second is that more can be delegated to those local community councils. So what happens right now is everything gets rolled up to city council, and we get these monstrous 4-day meetings that are pretty unwieldy and unfocused. The opportunity is to readjust what the decision making is that happens at those local community councils and to ensure that they're connected to local neighborhoods. There's great models in other places. LA has this. Of course, New York City has local planning boards, over 50 of them. These models, they're the messiness of democracy because you get lots of different voices at the table. I think for most of us in the room, we believe that's a good thing. I believe that's a good thing, and we're going to need really clear leadership to deliver a model of community councils that actually believes in taking the energy of neighborhoods and integrating it into decision making. Right now, if you want to remove a tree, that gets bumped up to city council and debated on the floor of city council in a city of 2.8 million people. That should not be happening. We have it within our authority as a city to reconfigure how the very local part of the governance happens in our city. And this is an incredible opportunity that is ahead of the next council. I think I used the making lemonade out of lemons thing early in the campaign because the decision has been made, and now we have to say, okay, how do we strengthen local democracy as a result of this and capture the energy that exists at the neighborhood level in our city and create really strong places?
Before in the last few days, we were soliciting questions from readers, telling them that you'd be here. And a lot of the questions came in the area of housing, as you can imagine, and taxes were kind of the first two big topics. One question that from a reader that I'll just put forward to you is, will you make Airbnb illegal to stop them from squeezing rental supplies? And I guess really, are you happy with the arrangements now with Airbnb, or would you change them?
So Airbnb has created an incredible problem in cities around the world by taking rental housing off the market and essentially turning it into a short-term commercial entity, and that's a problem. What we need in place are very clear regulations that limit, the idea behind home sharing was that you were sharing your home, sharing a room in your home, but sharing part of your principal residence. So I worked on this as the chief planner at the city, and this is currently something that is outstanding with the province in terms of the regulatory requirements that are necessary to implement this. My position is, and will continue to be, that Airbnb works when it is a principal residence and there's a limit on the amount of nights that can be rented out. Then it functions within the realm of home sharing. The minute that you can rent out something that isn't your principal residence and it becomes a place that is meant to be part of the hotel market, for lack of a better way of saying it, it is a problem, and it should not be allowed because it compromises access to rental housing in the city.
The current rules that are in place now, would you change them?
The current recommendation that is before City Council is the one that I worked on and is principal residence
Right.
with a limitation.
Right, so you'd be happy with that?
Yes, absolutely, but that hasn't been implemented.
Okay. Diane?
Ms. Keesmaat, road congestion in the city costs $6 billion in lost productivity every year. I'm just wondering what your plans are to reduce that.
So this is a really significant issue in our city, and we are going to see 1 million more people come to this city over the course of the next 20 years. We are a rapidly densifying city, and we should be adding more density. But the risk, of course, is that we don't change the way we move in the city. We must do that. We can't assume that we will move the way we did when we were a city of 1 million people, when we're a city of 3 or 4 million people. So my plan is about increasing choice. It's about ensuring that we're using the infrastructure in the best ways that we possibly can. Perfect example of that is the King Street pilot, which I advanced as chief planner. The King Street pilot was about recognizing that we have a very busy surface transit route with a small proportion of space allocated to transit, even though 64% of the people being moved in the corridor were being moved on transit. So we flipped that around, got the cars out of the way, and we saw 20,000 more people using that corridor for transit and getting a faster ride that was more reliable. So that's an example of a short-term win that can move more people. And we need to be increasing all of those choices, whether it's adding density in housing as part of my housing plan, where there's a 1-story transit station. Building housing above means people who live there don't need to own a car. They can get around on transit. So linking together our land use planning with our transit planning is absolutely essential to creating a city where we can move efficiently. It's about choice, and it's about using infrastructure better. So our streets right now and historically have been focused on moving cars, but we know we need to focus on moving people, and that's why cycling infrastructure matters. It's why having that dedicated space for a bus or a dedicated space for a streetcar matters as well. The big piece of this, which is where we can no longer delay, is on building out our transit network and building out our transit network plan, which is a central part of my platform, and I've provided a detailed plan in order to deliver that. One of the problems we have right now is that we have fallen behind again on building the relief line. The relief line is critical, essential infrastructure in this city. I've outlined a detailed plan as to how we can build it 3 years earlier than the current plan. And this is right at the heart of how we ensure that we are a livable city, even as we're adding density.
Just to follow up on that,
Sure.
Premier Ford has said he's going to take over the subway system from the city. How can you see a future working with him to do things, to build like the relief line when he may have other priorities, and how would you do that?
So my understanding is that Mr. Ford has promised to upload the building of the capital projects for subways, which would be the Scarborough subway, and I believe him that he will do that, and also the relief line. He's also indicated that as a priority. I have put back to Mr. Ford 3 conditions from my perspective that are essential to representing the public interest in Toronto. The first condition is that the transit system must remain public. If this is a move towards privatizing our transit system in any way, that's a problem, and Torontonians will need to have a very big conversation about that. The risk, of course, is that the subway system is the profitable part of the system. King Street, as a result of the King Street pilot, is also a profitable part of the system. If you skim the cream and take off the profitable parts of the system and operate them separately, what you'll see is the service level go down in the other parts of the system, because right now the transit system is cross-subsidized, that we have bus routes in areas where we wouldn't otherwise have them if you used a profit-based model, but we have a service-driven approach. So I've made it very clear that keeping transit public is an absolute starting point. The second is that the fare must remain the same. So what we don't want to see is a situation where the operations are changed and you have a different fare for the subway than you do on the bus or the LRT. This is not something to take for granted, because 60% of the trips in this city begin on a bus and then move on to either the subway or onto the streetcar. So if you're suddenly paying 2 fares, we're going to see the cost of accessing transit go through the roof. And that will be most detrimental in our suburbs, where residents are getting on a bus and then linking into other parts of the system. So ensuring that the fare stays the same for the entire system and that it's integrated is absolutely essential as well. And then the third is that the system must continue to be operated and maintained by the TTC. They do an excellent job at doing that, and there's no reason why the TTC should not be operating and maintaining the system as they do today.
May I just do one more follow-up?
Go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that the price of a MetroPass has gone up significantly in the
Yes.
past few years. Would you freeze transit fares?
Absolutely, and I think our objective needs to be working towards lowering the cost of transit in this city. It's too expensive. We have seen over the course of the past 8 years, we've seen service levels go down, and we've seen fares go up, and we've seen ridership flatlined. What have we also seen over that same period? An increase in commute times and an increase in congestion. So this is, I would argue, those two things are bad public policy. They're things that have happened on the watch of this past mayor. We should not be raising fares. We should be working towards lowering them and making transit more accessible. But we can't do that at the expense of service levels, because service levels and increasing service levels are the #1 priority of transit riders in this city, is access to more service.
Sir, can I just jump in quickly?
Sure.
And go back to something that you had answered in Diane's previous question, where you said you would make it clear that you have conditions. What if Premier
Yes.
Ford says, I don't care what your conditions are, and I'm going to do something entirely different? What would your answer be then? What would you do?
Well, I would not shrug him off, which, if someone said to you in passing, like it sounds like Mr. Ford said to Mr. Tory about shrinking the size of council, how can you say something like that in passing? I think what it's like your husband saying, oh, by the way, we're going to divorce. And then they walk out of the room. That's basically what happened. And it's one of the reasons why I'm running for mayor, because when something significant is happening, you actually stand up, you draw a line in the sand, you say, hold on a minute, we need to talk about this, and we need to negotiate what's in the interests of the residents of the city. And that's the job of the mayor. The job of the mayor is to represent the interests of the city of Toronto, not to hear something that's going to interfere with our democracy and say, oh, that was just in passing, not significant. No way, that's significant. You say, excuse me, we need a meeting, we need to talk about this. This is a problem. We've just been through a 2-year study consulting the residents of the Toronto, and that's what had happened at the city. None of that was mentioned. That should have been discussed. It should have been laid on the table. There should have been a meeting explicitly, and it should have immediately been made public, and city councilors should have been made aware that this was forthcoming. And that didn't happen. And that's what leaders do. So I will be a firm and clear negotiator, but I will not compromise the interests of the residents of this city, because that's your job as a leader, is to advocate the interests of your people, in this instance, the residents of the city of Toronto.
I just want to remind everybody that we're here with Jennifer Keesmaat, candidate for Mayor of Toronto on October 22nd at the Toronto Star. And another question that came in from a reader involves Uber. So Airbnb, Uber, all that stuff. Question really becomes, how does Uber and other ride-sharing services fit into the Toronto's Vision Zero plan, and how will you manage the congestion consequences of these cars? And I'll add to that, have we done enough to ensure safety? There's a very well publicized case not too long ago of a tragic death of a young man in an Uber, and people are saying, well, the standards were lowered. They were made equal for training between taxi drivers and Uber drivers, but by lowering standards rather than bringing the Uber drivers up. Was that a mistake, and should it be changed?
Yes, that was a mistake, and it should be changed, and it should be changed immediately. And it's very disappointing that, this is interesting because Mr. Tory talks a lot about negotiating compromises, but there's some things you don't compromise. And as the mayor, you never compromise public safety. And public safety was compromised. The question that should have been asked in those conversations in advancing a framework for Uber to operate in our city, the question should have been asked, what's the role of the municipality? And the answer to that question is, the role of the municipality is to maintain the public interest. What's the public interest? It's safety. So if the public interest is safety, you don't get to yes by negotiating away your primary obligation and responsibility, which is public safety. And that's exactly what happened. There was a lot of brouhaha, yay, we came to an agreement, but hold on a minute. a compromise that compromises away what matters most, which is public safety, I say that that's what you call a raw deal. And it was a raw deal, and it's tragic. I think the story that all of us have read about what's happened as a result of drivers not having the training that they require. And the training is about the safety of the drivers and the passengers, but also the public at large. And that's the role of the municipality, to always say, what's the public interest here, and how do I ensure in this new policy framework that I'm delivering the public interest? To the second part of the question, which is about congestion and rideshare, cities are changing, and this is a good thing. And I talked about providing options and having lots of choices. And in a good day, you can use the type of technology that you need to get around. You might use bike share, you might walk for a little bit, you might drive. What we want is for people to have lots of choices and have access to the choice that is going to best serve them in that moment. And ideally, we want excellent transit in every corner of the city, which is why my transit network plan is so important, because transit, we want to be the first choice for those longer trips, in part because it's such an efficient way. You can move so many people on transit. The risk, of course, is that we do not have an approach to our city that's based on that framework of providing lots of choices, and people still feel that the best way to get around is to drive. And if that's the case in our city, then rideshare, it's just going to contribute to congesting the city, because if the best way is still to drive, we're simply going to see the roads at capacity at all times. And this is why focusing on delivering transit and bike infrastructure is so essential in a rapidly densifying city. Is there a role for car share to play? Absolutely. And I was very disappointed when the city flubbed so badly its relationship with Car2Go. I'm a Car2Go member, and the city couldn't figure out and didn't see the value of providing that choice. And I think that's the absence of leadership. The opportunity is to ensure that we're creating a city where we have the best choices at the disposal of our residents at every time. And car share should just be one of those choices, but not the first choice.
Should the number of Uber drivers be capped? Some cities have capped the number, and when the numbers came out recently, there were tens of thousands. Now, they may all not be active, but should there be a cap on them?
I won't say. I think the part of it is about providing choices, and if there's a gap to be filled, let the market fill that gap, however they're going to fill it, with the public interest at its center. I'm much more concerned about driver safety and ensuring that drivers have the training. We have an excellent training program for taxi drivers that it had been developed over time, and taxi drivers went through a rigorous training program. And to your point, we lowered the common denominator. I'm much more concerned about that, and I think the role of the municipality is to ensure people are safe.
Jennifer, on the transit file, going back to the relationship with the Premier, you seem confident that Premier Ford is really set on building this 3-stop subway. Can you just explain whether any city dollars should be put towards that project? We've been raising a special tax for the subway since 2014 and into the next 30 years. Should we use any of that money for the subway, and how will Ford respond to us yanking those funds?
Well, I'm glad you asked this question, because it is a big point of differentiation between myself and John Tory. Premier Ford has made it clear that the province will upload the cost in the construction of the capital projects for subways. And I say, that's a very generous offer. We will take you up on that, with the conditions around being public and an integrated fare, with the conditions that I've put forward on the table. We will absolutely take the Premier up on that offer, and we need the province to play that role. And what we will do with that contribution, which was dedicated specifically to improving transit in Scarborough, we will build the Eglinton East LRT to Malvern. And we know from our planning analysis that that is in fact a critically important transit connection, because University of Toronto Scarborough campus is the second largest employment hub in Scarborough, and Malvern is a neighborhood improvement area that is in need of excellent transit. We also know that 42% of the transit trips that start in Scarborough end in Scarborough. And we know that that LRT corridor is the key destination where those trips end. So this is about enhancing and providing excellent transit in a network-based approach in Scarborough. So my plan is to take the money that has been allocated, that we no longer need to allocate to the capital building of that subway. The Premier has said he will take that on. I believe him. We say thank you, go ahead, take that on, and we're going to take our significant contribution and we're going to expedite the building of the LRT.
And you said something yesterday on the agenda about hearing from planners who you had worked with that they had been actually pulled off the Relief Line project to work specifically on Smart Track. Can you just talk about, there's been this challenge of priorities, of what we're actually prioritizing. The mayor says, we haven't taken away from the planning of the Relief Line and it's moved along as fast as it could, but it sounds like we've been talking a lot about whether we're going to build a 3-stop or a 1-stop Scarborough subway, or we're going to do some other subway line to north of Yonge, but the Relief Line has it been compromised on the planning front?
It absolutely has, and it's one of the reasons why I'm running for mayor in this city, is because we need to build out that transit network plan. We need to stop kind of monkeying around with these other back-of-the-napkin plans like we know that Smart Track was, and we need to build the key priorities in our network. We need to drive them forward. This is what I've done my entire professional life, so I know exactly how to get it done. I'm very worried as a resident of this city. We are losing time again. And that's why I had transportation experts look at the timeline for delivering the Relief Line and figure out exactly how we could deliver it 3 years earlier by collapsing some of the tasks that are now proposed to happen sequentially and having them happen concurrently. Advancing every part of that network plan at the same time is going to be essential to getting at congestion. We are literally decades behind, and we've lost another 4 years because the key priority at City Hall over the past 4 years was not the transit network plan, it was Smart Track. And that's why there was a great big report on Smart Track stations, which one could easily argue that's actually the provincial jurisdiction. Planners were spending a lot of time planning GO stations instead of planning the transit network that we need in our city. So my priority is to ensure that we have the teams that we require in place that are dedicated, not tiny little teams, which is what we have today. A really good example is if you look at the Broadview line in Vancouver, which is a subway line that is being proposed that has a dedicated team of upwards of 10 or 15 staff working full-time on it. We don't even have that many planners working on transit planning overall in the city of Toronto. So we are, if we have a question as to why it's not getting done, it's usually because it's no one's job to get it done. That's a problem. This is something that a mayor who believes in delivering the transit network plan can fix, putting the teams in place.
Sarah, do you have a question from a reader?
Yes, so we have a question from a reader who's watching live on YouTube, and they want to know, how will you find the revenue to invest in our future when we depend on the land transfer tax to just keep us afloat?
So I have not proposed that we get rid of the land transfer tax, but what we do need is a better alignment with the federal and provincial government, and we've been inching towards that. But now we need leadership to deliver that on a whole new scale. So this is something that's been discussed in Canadian cities across Canada for many years. We've never gotten there. And part of what we need to do is be aggressive in advancing very clearly this realignment. We literally have billions and billions of dollars that we contribute to the province that we don't get back as a city. Billions of dollars that we give to the federal government that we don't give back. What we need to do is build a campaign. We need to identify very clearly the value that we contribute and the risks, $6 billion cost with respect to congestion in the city, the risk of not having the right alignment in terms of the investment that's being made in our Canadian cities. And a coalition across this country in order to deliver that is absolutely essential. It's been, I would say, not happening at the scale that it needs to be happening. It's a conversation that we need to reignite. It was happening about a decade ago around the creation of the City of Toronto Act, but we're not even near making the case in the way that we need to make the case in order to move into the 21st century.
I have a more general question. The way I see the election now, I see you as a candidate for the future, I see John Tory as status quo, and I see Ford as the candidate who wants to revive the past. And then I was thinking about the news story about we have 12 years to prep for serious climate change or great damage will ensue. How can you negotiate with somebody who wants to return to the past when that is really not even possible? You can't negotiate with people like Trump. Can you negotiate with Ford? Is there any point in being reasonable, as John Tory keeps saying, referendums and so on, pointless things?
Yeah, well, referendum, we knew that couldn't happen, so that was just like filling up the air.
Yeah.
It was, I think it was disingenuous. Something that a phone call to the clerk would have put why put that out there? And it might have been something that sounded nice politically, but we knew that it was not something that was going to happen. There are a couple of things here, and the first is that part of the nature of bullies is that they like to pick on people who they know won't push back, right? The big kid pushing the small kid. And I would argue that's sort of what happened. Doug Ford's the big kid and John Tory's the small kid, and he got pushed and he didn't think he would push back. And so a critical part of dealing with a bully is standing up, stiffening your spine, and being very clear. And we're in a lucky situation. I'm in a lucky situation because there's a very tiny woman in our country who's actually just done an excellent job of doing this with one of the biggest bullies in the world, Chrystia Freeland. She did it. She stood up, stiffened her spine, and said, "We will act with clarity about Canadian interests, and we will not compromise on those Canadian interests." And come on, it's a pretty damn big bully, right? So I think we need to ensure that we have a leader who is not afraid. I built a very large company in this country, and one of the ways that I was able to do that was knowing when to push and knowing the times when you need to hold down. And if the province wants to come for the things that are essential to the City of Toronto, like our public transit system, or is going to compromise in any other way, start selling off public assets, that's when you stand up and you act with a tremendous amount of clarity about what is in the public interest. So I would say the status quo isn't going to work in this situation because all the rules of the game have just significantly changed, precisely because we do have someone who wants to take us back into the past. I'll also add that there are many things we can do as a city that we're not doing today. And unfortunately, I think there's been a narrative, it's the status quo narrative, I've only got one vote, there's not much I can do. I had no votes on the King Street pilot, but I got it done. You get it done by building the case and persuading those around you that this is in the public interest. On the Gardiner Expressway, the province has made it clear that they won't interfere, that if Toronto wants to take down the expressway, they're not going to get in our way. On the housing, building 100,000 units of homes that people can afford in this city, the province has no role to play in that, and we don't need their money on that because we're building that housing by using the asset we have, which is our land. Currently, Mr. Tory is selling off that land for luxury condos, and I raised this with him in the debate the other day, and I don't even think he realized that he's doing this. But you can just go to the Create TO website, and you'll see all the beautiful luxury condos that are now built on City of Toronto land. And my plan is saying, no, let's not do that anymore. Let's build housing for Torontonians that currently can't access the housing market in our city on that land. That's something as well that we can do without any provincial permission. So my strategy is to be very clear about what our influence is. Where is it that we can have a really big impact? We can get transit built, we can get housing built, we can create stronger and safer neighborhoods. We can do that, and we really don't have to worry too much about a bully.
I want to remind everybody that we're here with Jennifer Keesmaat, candidate for Mayor of Toronto on October 22nd, here at the Toronto Star. And Catherine, I think you might have had a question.
Well, I'm listening to your lines in the sand and standing up to a bully. Last week you announced your plan for gender equity at City Hall. Often when people announce these plans, there seems to be a fairly long time frame attached to it. What's your time frame? How fast can it happen?
It can happen immediately. It can happen within the first 100 days. It's a policy decision. It does not take writing reports and debating. There are certain things where you don't go out and do broad consultation. You do it because it's the right thing to do. And that's my proposal. Within the first 100 days, we will put a requirement in place for agencies, boards, and commissions within a 2-year period to have advanced gender equity.
Any hurdles?
Any hurdles? I think the biggest hurdle, which I saw as chief planner, because I was the first woman in that role, and I had a team of all male directors. I had one acting director that was a woman, but I had a team of wonderful, talented, capable, all male team. And it took quite a bit of work to in fact find women, when they didn't see themselves in that part of the organization, to see themselves as having a contribution to make. So I don't think it's an easy thing to do, but I think it's the right thing to do. And sometimes you say, this is the right thing to do. We are going to have a better city. We are going to have better decisions. The embarrassing thing is the private sector is out way ahead of us on this. There's no reason for the City of Toronto not to be advancing gender equity on boards and commissions. The private sector has been banging this drum, and there's data that demonstrates boards make better decisions when they're more representative and when they have more women, which is why it's such a big mandate in the private sector. We can do it too. It'll take tenacity. We'll have to put our shoulder to the wheel and believe in it to get it done, but it's worth it.
Matt, did you have a question?
You've talked about getting cars off the streets and about perhaps asking for more money from people who can afford it. Would you bring back the vehicle registration tax that Rob Ford killed?
So I haven't actually talked about getting cars off the street. What I've talked about is providing more choice, so that the best choice is to take transit or to cycle or to walk. And that's about design. And this has always been my approach. It was my approach as chief planner. And we see this when we design communities with more choice, that people take those choices. When we provide excellent bus service at a high frequency, people will choose to use it. If that bus only shows up every half hour and you have to stand out in the cold at the side of the road, it's not that great of a choice. So we have to make real choices for transit in every corner of our city. With respect to the vehicle registration tax, I have not anticipated bringing that back.
You want to jump in with a reader question?
Yes, so another person watching on YouTube says that every time I am in other major cities, I see parks that vastly outshine our own. So what will you do to improve our green spaces?
This is a really important question, because as the city becomes more and more dense, the public spaces and the parks become more and more precious and more important. And we have some places in our city where our parks are being loved to death. There's so many people that the parks are seeing a significant amount of wear and tear. So we have an opportunity to better use the land that we have. I proposed and have brought forward a policy direction, which is very different from what's currently being done at the city, to use 3 of the city-owned golf courses as year-round free public spaces that we will develop in consultation with local communities in order to ensure that the mix of recreational activities on those lands, which are typically Toronto Regional Conservation Authority lands, but also some of them are near our ravines and are breathtakingly beautiful, that we will ensure that they are excellent ecological spaces, naturalized spaces, but also spaces for human activity, cross-country skiing and cricket pitches and baseball diamonds and other kinds of activity that will draw the community in.
There's all sorts of recreational opportunities in the city for people who cross-country ski and walk through ravines and everything. Why target the golf courses that people go to them with their families, like they do other activities in the city?
For a very clear reason, which is that across North America and in Toronto, golf is in decline. So less and less people every year are using those golf courses, and they're only open half of the year. So to be a big cosmopolitan city and to have land that is sitting there 6 months of the year unused, we have to move beyond that. This is about looking into the future. We also have an opportunity because many of these golf courses are adjacent to neighborhood community improvement areas where there is a need and to be accessing better local community recreational activities. So we have declining use, we have open only half of the year and for a user fee, and they're also subsidized and require another $10 million of investment over the next several years in order to be maintained. So we've hit that tipping point where we can actually transition into the future and better use these spaces to create really community hubs where communities have a local amenity. And as the city gets denser, that's a good thing too. So it's about looking into the future and being future oriented and transforming these spaces to be for the communities that are adjacent to them.
Sorry,
I just wanted to go back to something on the gender equity question. You said that you'd implement in 100 days and within 2 years, and you mentioned the boards. But your plan also talks for gender parity for senior staff within the city public service.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying within 2 years that's 50-50?
No, that was with respect to the agencies, boards, and commissions. That is a much harder part because which I gave the example of when I was chief planner and I had all male directors, and it took 5 years of being very focused to get to an excellent team of that had gender parity. So I haven't put a timeline on that because it's contingent on a whole series of other variables, including when positions are opening up. Over the course of this term of council, there's going to be hundreds of positions opening up on agencies and boards and commissions where we have a vacancy that we know. It's a little different with full-time professional or staff positions at the City of Toronto. So I separate those two out.
Doug, do you have questions?
Just getting back to something that Heather mentioned, something that hasn't been asked a lot about on the campaign, but I wanted to ask you. In terms of climate change, what are your policies around the city reducing its carbon emissions, and also presuming that if you were in power over the next 4 years, we'd be increasingly feeling the effects of climate change already? What would your infrastructure priorities be in terms of investing what's already going to be taxed?
So there's two key priorities with respect to climate change, and one is building up our city's resilience, and the other is adapting. We're getting our climate is getting warmer, we're going to have more flooding, and we need to adapt and change our infrastructure, recognizing that this isn't the city it was 10 years ago, and it's going to be a very different city in the next 5 years and in the next 10 years. And that's climate change isn't in the future, it's something that's happening right now. The Gardiner Expressway is a perfect metaphor for this. Why would we be focusing on building infrastructure that is incredibly intensive in terms of its carbon that it's required, both to build and to maintain, and also in terms of how people move, when we can be building a neighborhood where people can walk, where people can cycle, and where we're designing the land and planning the land in such a way that we can be absorbing water. So we need to be focusing on, in our planning moving forward, thinking about a whole variety of variables. Buildings and how we design buildings and how we make those buildings greener and greener. And I was very proud of the opportunity that I had as chief planner to be bringing forward the green roof bylaw. We now have more green roofs than any other city in the world. And it's precisely because industry said it couldn't be done, it would kill development in the city, and we said, nope, this is the right thing to do. This is about our resilience as a city and ensuring that we're absorbing water and we're mitigating the effects of the urban island heat that you get in environments where you have a lot of concrete. So there's the building piece and having stronger policies around building green buildings. There's how we move in the city. So focusing on transit, cycling, density so that people can walk from place to place. That's the next piece. And then the third piece is planning for change through trees, how we absorb water. Raindrop Plaza is a really great example of a pilot project that I advanced as chief planner, which is really about a stormwater management function on Coxwell Avenue that sort of looks like a little parkette, but it's actually a stormwater management feature. And we could be building out thousands and thousands of these types of green infrastructure. We know exactly how to do it because we've done the pilot, but it takes political will to get it done.
I think we have time for one or two questions.
Question.
I think Jennifer had a question.
I just wanted to know if you had anticipated running in this campaign earlier on. It had not been a decision that you took after a series of changes to the ward structure. You know, if you had announced your intention to run in January, what would you have done differently? What would we have seen from you that we might not get a chance to see in the next 10 days?
Well, I won't speculate as to what I would have done differently because who knows. With respect to anticipating this, well, I would have spent. I really can't speculate on that. I can't look into a different future that doesn't exist. But what I will say is that when I left the city as chief planner, I truly thought that that was closing that chapter and moving on from the city. And you can see that in the comments that I made. And one of the things that became very clear over the course of the following months was that there was an incredible appetite in this city for us to be a forward-looking city. And people kept coming up to me on a daily basis, coming up to me and saying, we need someone who believes in the future of this city and is prepared to advance a future vision for this city that is focused on taking Toronto into the 21st century as opposed to keeping it the same. And then over that time period, we of course had a terrible crisis and the inaction of our current mayor and our current administration on addressing the housing crisis that we saw at Christmas time in very cold conditions when people were left out in the street. What that put into focus for me is that we've become this incredibly prosperous city. That's what's happened to us. We've become really, really prosperous. But as we know from the research of David Helczynski, that as we've become more prosperous, we've also become a city that has become more and more exclusive. There are neighborhoods that have been completely left out of that prosperity. And a mayor of this city needs to acknowledge that and needs to be willing to address that, because the vast majority of Torontonians in every single corner of this city, North York, Scarborough, Etobicoke, East York, the beach, Mimico, everywhere I go in this city, no one thinks that's acceptable. And for some reason, our current mayor is not doing anything about it. We have a status quo plan. And so there has been this building recognition that our city is actually becoming something fundamentally different than what it was. This used to be a place where you could come with $200 in your suitcase and make a life, and that increasingly is not the case. And the Toronto Real Estate Board released data last week saying 94% of youth between the ages of 18 and 30 are thinking about leaving this city because they can't see their future here. And that is heartbreaking. And that's not who we are as a city. We've always been about welcoming newcomers, but we've become something fundamentally different. We've always been a place where young people can see and imagine their dreams come true. And that's no longer the case today. And this hit me very personally several months ago when my daughter said to me that she had a part-time job teaching kids. And I said to her, "Oh, Alex, maybe you want to be a teacher." And she looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Are you kidding? I could never afford to live in Toronto if I was a teacher." That's a kid who's, she's white, she's got every privilege and every opportunity, and she can't see her future in this city. Then let's take that to kids that are in low-income neighborhoods who are not white and multiply that by 100. Come on, that's not who we are. That's never been who we are. How can we let that happen and not be outraged? David Helczynski's research should outrage us as a city. And Torontonians have been approaching me over the course of the past 6 months and saying, we can do so much better. We can do so much better as a city. And the status quo is not acceptable. And if we've got so much data, it's embarrassing. We know we've got the worst commute times in North America. We know we pay the highest rents in Canada. We've got all kinds of data that makes it very clear that we need to reset our course as a city. Because just looking at the shiny object we've become, that's not who we are. We're way more than that, and we need to go back to that.
I think last question for Christine.
So I'd like to go back to what you said about standing up to Doug Ford. Obviously, getting things done municipally means being able to work effectively with the province. How are you going to be able to do that better than John Tory? I mean, you've said you'll stand up to Doug Ford, but that doesn't necessarily result in positive outcomes. So why are you better? Why are you going to be better than John? Tory at working with the province?
So I will be better at John than working with the province, because I will approach this role with an absolute clarity of what the interest is, which is the interest of Torontonians. I'll give you an example. When a premier decides to interfere in a local election, and a mayor learns about that, the mayor doesn't think, does this hurt or help me? A mayor says, what is the impact on the residents of this city and local democracy? That's the question that a leader asks and that a mayor asks. And I have to go back to the Chrystia Freeland example, because I think she is a wonderful role model in approaching negotiations with someone who, let's face it, might not be coming across as your friend. Donald Trump was pretty rough and tough and said some pretty unfortunate things in advance of those negotiations in the public domain. And yet, Chrystia Freeland approached it with absolute clarity as to what the interest was that she was advancing. Should we all think that she's a buddy of Mr. Trump? Absolutely not. I also think that it's going to be very, very hard for a conservative mayor to fight conservative cuts, which we know are coming. And, you know, John Tory was the leader of the Conservative Party for 5 years. There's an agenda that's coming. We've seen some of it already, that is about compromising exactly what I've just been talking about around creating an inclusive city and a city where everyone has an opportunity, creating a green city. We've seen the killing of all of our green energy programs, and there hasn't been a peep out of this city. And we know that killing the carbon tax has an incredible implication for Toronto community housing. Who's talking about it? Those are the kinds of things where a mayor stands up and says, hold on a minute, these have implications for our city, and these are the things that we're concerned about, and this is a way forward. And I think that Chrystia Freeland is actually a really good example of a woman who's been able to do that and has provided a very good role model for the way any mayor in this city, I think any mayor, no matter who the mayor is, can take a page out of her playbook.
On that note, thank you so much for coming and sharing your views with us. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you all.